Good afternoon, everybody. This is Anthony Starr from the Illinois Power Agency. We're going to give people just a few more minutes to join, so we'll be getting started shortly. Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Anthony Starr. I'm the director of the Illinois Power Agency. I think we have a critical mass of people who've joined, so let's get started for our afternoon workshop. Thank you, everybody who participated this morning, for coming back this afternoon, and welcome anyone who did not participate this morning and is joining us for the first time this afternoon. So I'm going to go through a few slides that are the same opening slides as the morning. I'm going to go through them a little faster than we did in the morning, just for the information and background and context, some helpful reminders, and then also that will be useful for those who did not take part in the morning. So next slide, please. So this is an overall agenda, excuse me, for the workshops that we're holding today. We had a morning session where we covered some high-level questions about the renewable portfolio standard, a discussion of utility scale and brownfield procurements, the large customer self-direct program, which is a new component of the work the IPA is doing, was discussed. And then we also discussed diversity, equity, and inclusion provisions at a high level. We will be getting some more detail on some specific aspects of that as it applies to the adjustable block program and Illinois Solar for All program. And then we wrapped up the morning session with a overview of some of the issues we're looking at as we're considering updates to how we price renewable energy credits for the adjustable block program and Illinois Solar for All. For this afternoon, we are going to cover 3 items. We're going to start with the adjustable block program, a combination of some open items from our withdrawn long-term plan from the summer, as well as new items related to the implementation of CEJA. We then will discuss issues related to Illinois Solar for All. And then our final session will be a discussion of consumer protections, which is a very critical component of the work the Illinois Power Agency does and how we run our programs. But through some changes in the law now is something that is going to be addressed slightly differently than it was in the past. And so we're breaking that out into its own standalone section, and we'll be going into some more detail on that and how we codify some of the work we've done around consumer protections. Next slide. So the logistics of today's workshop is first a reminder that today's workshop is being recorded and will be available on the IPA's website after the workshop is concluded. I understand that the morning's workshop and this morning's workshop recording and slides are actually already up on our website. What we're going to do is there'll be similar format to the morning in that we will have IPA staff present on various topics and then pause to take comments and questions. And some places we'll do that a little bit going along. Other places where things are more naturally grouped, we'll do sort of a series of issues and then pause. In general, please use the chat feature if you wish to make comments or ask questions. All participants are on mute, so if you wish to speak to clarify a question or a comment, please use the raise hand option, which you can find under reactions. We had a few people do that this morning, and that was very helpful for some slightly more complicated points or comments to give people the opportunity to do that. So please make use of those two tools that are available for us to receive your input this afternoon. Next slide. A reminder that the context for today's workshop is that we released a series of requests for stakeholder feedback on Friday, November 12th. And what we're doing is running through the issues that we posed in those questions. And this is an opportunity to have some dialogue on those and take some initial feedback from stakeholders. We strongly recommend and encourage stakeholders to also submit written comments to us. That's ultimately, as we work through developing the next long-term plan, written comments are very helpful to us because then we can really dive more deeply into topics and make sure we fully understand the position someone may be taking on a particular topic. Those written comments are due December 3rd. The email address to send them to would be ipa.contactus@illinois.gov. Next slide, please. So this afternoon, presenting along with myself, I'm Anthony Starr, the director of the agency, is Brian Granahan, our chief legal counsel. Then we also have Audrey Steinbach, the program manager for the Adjustable Block Program, Jennifer Schmidt, the program manager for Illinois Solar for All, Emily Asbury, our program associate, will also be presenting. Sharon Johnson, our diversity, equity, and inclusion manager, will be taking a piece of today's presentation. And then Kelly Turner, our deputy legal counsel, also will be presenting on consumer protections. Assisting us today and helping facilitate the questions and comments are Megha Hamal, our communications manager, and Sarah Duffy, our associate legal counsel. So you may see their names pop up in the chat from time to time. Next slide, please. Well, the focus of the workshops we're holding today are on the long-term plan and taking stakeholder feedback to help inform the development of that plan. I also wanted to highlight the Power Hour series that the IPA has been holding. These are educational events, a series of them to really help unpack all the complexity and new provisions of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. We've held 3 of those to date, and we actually have another one tomorrow and then a few more over the coming weeks. So those, this is the information about those power hours. Those are also available on our website as they get conducted. We'll post the recordings of them. So if you're not able to make them at the time they're being presented, you can come back later and listen to those. And that's a really helpful way that if you want to get a little bit of more context or detail on aspects of the new provisions of CJA, it's a learning opportunity for that. Next slide. Just a reminder of the context of what we're doing is that the long-term plan development timeline is that we develop a long-term plan to manage our renewable resources programs and procurements. This flows from changes to the law that were enacted through the Future Energy Jobs Act, which took effect back in 2017. At that time, we developed the first long-term plan in 2017, and it was approved in early 2018. The 2-year cycle then led us to have a second plan that was, or the first revised plan that was approved in early 2020. And we started down the path of the second revised plan when we released a plan for public comment in August of this year. That plan, however, was withdrawn on September 16th because the passage of Public Act 102-0662 or CJA required us to develop a new plan on a 120-day timeline. So we pulled that plan back and we are now in this process, and this is one of the steps in the development of the new plan. The overall timeline we have is that we're now in this period between when the law took effect and January 13th when we will be publishing a draft plan. this is sort of today is sort of, and the written comments flowing today is what I think of as the first bite of the apple for stakeholders to provide input to the agency on the many topics that we need to consider in the plan. The second bite at the apple comes after we publish that draft plan, that there is an opportunity for stakeholders to provide comments to us. We will consider those comments and then revise the plan and file it with the Illinois Commerce Commission in mid-March. And then it goes through a more formal regulatory process at the Commerce Commission. That's the third bite of the apple, where stakeholders can participate in that docket proceeding at the Illinois Commerce Commission. And ultimately, the Commerce Commission will approve the plan in mid-July. And at that point in time, that plan will be the plan that governs the agency's activities around renewable energy. If you want to look at our previous plans, they all are available on our website, including the withdrawn plan, which I think there are a number of aspects of that plan that were things just sort of clean up certain parts of our operational processes and procedures that we also are sort of planning to pull forward into this next plan above and beyond the specific things we need to change to comply with CEJA. Next slide. So with that, I will now turn to the adjustable block program. So to start, I want to talk a little bit about annual block capacity. So to step back for a moment, when FEJA passed and set up the adjustable block program, it set up this concept of blocks of capacity that we would set, and that over time, as a block of capacity filled up, the next block would open at a new price, with the assumption that over time, prices would go down and step down over time. And we set up a schedule in the initial long-term plan of sizes of blocks designed to get to our initial goal of 1 million RECs being delivered annually from the adjustable block program. That model had its ups and downs, but one of the changes in CEJA was that I think advocates wanted and got included in it was a move from the capacity-based blocks to the idea of annual blocks. I think as blocks closed, I think it created a certain amount of anxiety because if prices changed between blocks, I think people were rushing to get projects in. And while in general, there was a lot of things about the adjustable block program that created more certainty to the market than earlier solar programs the Illinois Power Agency ran, the uncertainty around block timing was something that maybe was not helpful to the industry. So we're now moving to a model of annual blocks based upon delivery year. But we have some timing challenges here that we're really interested in feedback on, because we have a set of sort of slightly contradictory provisions in that, separate from the development of the long-term plan, we were instructed to open the adjustable block program's next block of capacities within 90 days of when the law took effect, which is in December 14th of this year. And there's a whole process laid out in the law for that opening, the size of the blocks, the price of the blocks, etc. Now, the long-term plan is scheduled to be approved in July of 2022, yet there's also references in the law to the concept of annual blocks of capacity tied to delivery years, and an energy delivery year starts June 1st. So how do we reconcile these in that we won't have our new plan that specifies what we do with the blocks that are not part of that initial opening approved until after the next delivery year starts? So do we backdate the opening of the next set of blocks to June 1st, 2022? That, though, would cause challenges because there'd be some uncertainty about what applies to any project that applies between June 1st, 2022 and when the plan is approved, because that plan would govern this next annual block. Do we, on the other hand, if the plan gets approved in July, waiting to June 1st, 2023 clearly is too long. So we're interested in pragmatic approaches that are consistent with the law on how we should think about this next annual block. And is there some other way, perhaps, of prorating the timing of these blocks? Another question that I think we just want to have a little bit of clarity on people's understanding is that for a few categories of the adjustable block program, there's discussion of the idea that the initial capacity that opens in December of this year is for the first 2 years. So what does that first 2 years apply to? Is it the initial period of the 21-22 delivery year and then the 2022 to 2023 delivery year, which would mean that any blocks after that initial 2-year allocation would open June 1st, 2023? Is that an accurate understanding of how that language works, or is there another way we should look at it? Another question we have around blocks is how should we size them? Because we now have this goal of annual blocks of capacity. And then provisions that if a capacity for a block is filled up, projects get put on wait lists, and then capacity is allocated for the beginning, and any unused capacity on blocks is allocated for the opening of in the next delivery year. So there's a couple of different ways to think about blocks. One would be looking forward to 2030, where we have a goal to have 45 million RECs delivered annually from the RPS. And if you work through the numbers, you get to about a little over 12 million of those RECs should be coming from the adjustable block program. So we could have a model that really is designed just to ramp up from where we are today at a little bit over 1 million RECs that have been procured to date up to that 12 million quantity. We could have something that is sort of, scales up over time on the assumption that the industry will be ramping up over time. Another way to think about this would be more of a market-based approach where there's allocations of capacity between different categories of the adjustable block program. Should we look at what is the likely annual market potential for a distributed generation market in particular? So that's something we'd be interested in. Where do people see the market potential looking like over the next few years? Another factor around block capacity is that when we initially set the blocks, one of the challenges we had is that the RPS is framed in terms of procurement of renewable energy credits. And renewable energy credits correlate basically with energy production. But that's not really how people think about the size of solar projects. People think about the size of solar projects in their KW or NW size. So we used a simple 16.5% capacity factor to convert megawatt or kilowatt sizes of projects to the number of RECs that they would produce, and that we use that across blocks. Now, the reality is different types of projects have different capacity factors. In general, community solar projects, for example, tend to have higher capacity factors. The ground-mounted systems, often with trackers, they produce more kilowatt or megawatt hours per kilowatt or megawatt of installed capacity than a fixed mount system. So should we think about having different capacity factors as we translate block sizes to REC quantities? It sounds like a small consideration, but actually could have a significant impact in terms of the size of the different blocks relative to the amount of capacity that's in them. So that's something that I think I'd be interested in feedback. Do we use a simplifying approach to create consistency, or do we tailor things more to the specific technologies that we're looking at? We're also interested in how do we think about redistributing uncontracted capacity. There's provisions in the law that if there's capacity left over in a category at the end of the year, that it would be redistributed to the other categories where there are wait lists. Should we do that on purely first come, first serve basis, or is there some other process for thinking about redistributing uncontracted capacity? Finally, another issue is application fees. There's an application fee for adjustable block program projects. When should that be due? There's something to be said for having it be part of the application, even when you're on a wait list, because it is one way of demonstrating project maturity and project seriousness. If we don't charge it, do we then run the risk of less viable projects being submitted just to take spots on the wait list, and we only discover that they're not as viable once we get to the point where they can be taken off the wait list? Or do we realize that because there's potential, if a block fills up quickly, projects could be on a wait list for a while? Do we recognize that and only charge the application fee when a project comes off of the wait list? So those are a number of questions around annual block capacity. If we could pause for a moment now and see if there's any questions or comments.
No questions or comments so far.
And again, these are items that that may well lend themselves to more written comments and more give people a little bit more time and thought to go onto those. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Audrey for the next set of questions.
Actually, Emily will be presenting on these, so I will hand it over to her.
Okay, thank you, Audrey and Emily, or Audrey and Anthony. This is Emily Asbury, Program Associate with the IPA. In these next two slides, I'm going to be going through some of the open questions from the agency's draft second revised long-term plan, which Anthony mentioned earlier was originally published on August 16th, 2021, and subsequently withdrawn after CJA was signed into law. And as you'll see on these next few slides, it covers many topics, so I'll be sure to pause after each slide to allow some time for any comments or questions. So this first one has to do with an issue that we've seen a couple of times in the program, particularly in rural areas. How can the agency ensure that parcels that serve separate residential and agricultural uses are classified properly in terms of co-location? The next question regards small subscriber adders. Considering potential cost reductions for community solar providers through methods such as online marketing and enrollment, should small subscriber adders be reduced? And then last on this slide, we touched on in the morning session as well. How can the agency increase the number of diverse business entities, such as minority, women, veteran, disability-owned, or small businesses? Specifically, what are barriers to entry currently observed in the market, and how can those barriers be addressed adequately to ensure a more diverse pool of program participants? So we'll pause briefly here and see if we have any questions or comments.
Nothing in the chat yet.
Okay, great. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on to interconnection agreements. The agency is interested in feedback on specific alternatives to signed interconnection agreements for new community solar applications where there may be a long lead time between the project application and selection. Metering standards. The agency is seeking feedback on how the new DC metering standard that was finalized in March 2021 will be applicable and relevant to its programs. On to batches. Should the initial batch size of 100 kilowatts and or 75% verification level for new minority or women-owned approved vendors be set at a lower level? And then lastly on the slide, should the agency allow circumstances in which collateral from projects withdrawn from the program can be rolled over to newly applied projects? How should these exceptions be applied? And that's the end of our open questions from the withdrawn draft second revised plan. And we'll pause here and see if we have any questions or comments.
No questions or comments right now.
Okay, great, thank you. With that, I'll hand it over to Audrey.
Thanks, Emily. I think we can advance to the next slide. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Audrey Steinbach, and I'm the program manager for the Adjustable Block program. So now we will be posing some questions that stem from a new category established by CJA called the Equity Eligible Contractor category. So the Act requires that this category grows over time to 40% from the initial 10% required for program reopening. So a few questions come from this. Over how many years should that increase from 10% to 40% occur? And what mechanisms should be used to ensure that this percentage goal is met? We can go to the next slide. So the Act also refers to applicants as the entities eligible for this category. Are there different interpretations of the law for the agency to consider, such as qualification through designees, subcontractors, or a company's workforce, as opposed to applicants or approved vendors? In that same vein, if designees or subcontractors are permitted to qualify for this category, would the category be limited to projects that have both an equity eligible contractor certified designee and an equity eligible contractor certified approved vendor? Additionally, how can the agency ensure that this category is not dominated by a select few qualifying aggregators or firms that outside of general company status may not otherwise substantially advance the equity goals that we are looking to advance here through the program. Should additional requirements be considered for equity eligible contractors to protect against this, or to kind of make sure that the goals set forth through these changes are actually being met? Next, equity eligible contractors may be eligible for an advance payment for a portion of their REC contract. So to be eligible for this pre-development capital, what standard for demonstration of qualification of need should be considered by the agency? Additionally, for that advance of this pre-development capital, what costs should be considered in determining the amount that should be advanced? Should those costs vary by project type or size? And what consequences would result if capital is advanced and then a project fails to then energize? And lastly, should the agency cap the share of projects eligible for this pre-development capital or advance payment? If so, what level should it be capped at and why? So that was a decent amount of questions on this new program category. So I'll stop here for any questions.
One of the things I want to emphasize on the equity eligible contractor category is that the advance of capital provision is a really important part of this category. And I think was, as this was developed, this was one of the, things that was looked at as what are the barriers to new entrants into the industry that will help it become more diverse and equitable industry. And access to capital is one of those issues that comes up frequently. So this option of having the ability to have an advance of capital is something that we think would be a real change for the adjustable block program, where to date the payments are only made once projects are completed, and this could really sort of transform how projects are developed and create some new opportunities. But we really want to make sure we think through properly how we structure this, what the right amounts are, and what are the appropriate provisions so that this is effectively meeting the goals that are intended by it.
There aren't any questions in the chat at the moment.
Okay, great. I will hand it back over to Anthony to discuss community-driven community solar.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. So, excuse me. Community-driven community solar is a new category that was created for the adjustable block program, like the equity eligible contractor category. And the intent here is, with the first bullet point, this is a quotation from the Act, of the intent to create community solar projects that have more direct and tangible connections and benefits to the communities in which they serve. To date, nearly all of the community solar projects we've seen in Illinois have been greenfield site projects, not necessarily near the customers that ultimately end up subscribing to them. So this is something that I think has been long been an interest in terms of what is community solar and what benefits does it create to communities, is how to create these stronger connections. And we had proposed some stuff in our first revised plan, a proposal on how we would start thinking about more community-based community solar projects as a, had funding become available, and that plan during the period of time that plan was in effect. That obviously did not happen, but some of the principles and concepts there were extended into the creation of this new category in the law. So we have a few issues here to work through, and so the next slide will be a little dense, but I'll try to unpack them as best I can. First is that we are charged to develop a selection process that maximizes community ownership and community benefits. I think there's a presumption that this category will be one where there would be more projects applying than capacity available. So we need to have a way to prioritize those projects that meet the goals of the Act, and also ensure that the projects that apply really are community-driven community solar. One thing I want to note here is that for the initial block opening that starts on December 14th, there's a different process for selecting projects that ties back to some of the criteria we had in the current revised long-term plan. And we took stakeholder feedback on that recently and in the process of working through some of the recommendations and thoughts we got there for what the criteria are for the initial blocks that open for the community-driven community solar. The law then gives us a different set of criteria to look at for future blocks once the plan is approved, and that's what I'll be going through shortly. One thing I want to flag that's sort of separate from the criteria for selection is the timing issue. One thing we've heard regularly is the thought that projects like these take a while to develop. There's some provisions around encouraging projects that are in response to a request for proposals issued by a community group or local government, and those obviously take time to be conducted. So certainly when a program like this first launches, you'd have to think about how much time you would want for initial applications, and we got a variety of opinions in the feedback we got on the initial opening on that issue. But going forward, once this program is more in sort of a steady state and up and running, so that entities would know the schedule for what it looks like, we still need a application window, because if we're going to have you can't really have a selection process unless you have a defined set of applications that you're selecting from. So we still need to have a selection window, and our proposal initially for future years where this thing, again, things a little bit more mature, would be a 90-day window for that. That'd be opening up at the beginning of each energy delivery year. So one high level question would be, is that an appropriate window going forward? Next slide. Excuse me. So there's two sets of criteria for community-driven community solar. There's a sort of primary set of criteria, and then there's some additional criteria in the act. And so I'm going to walk through what our sort of initial proposal is for how we would consider these, assign points to them, but then also have questions about how we look at them. So the set of 5 criteria you see listed here, the first one is projects that have community ownership or community wealth building. And we're curious to get some input on what does community ownership look like, and how would that be structured, and what minimum criteria would we need. Then also, what does community wealth building looks like? And over what period of time would that need to be done? Is this a one-time, oh, can we go back a slide, please? Thank you. Is this a one-time infusion of wealth, or is it something that's going on over time? So that's a set of issues again, and these are some new concepts for us. So we understand in principle what these ideas mean, but in terms of putting these into practice or something that we can evaluate in a project selection process, we need to put some firmer parameters around that. There's also criteria around additional direct and indirect community benefits, as listed here in number 2. So how should we evaluate those and score those? And do these have to be direct benefits to people, or can they be more indirect things as well? So there's, again, some concepts here that we were really looking for advice on how to put structure around them. Meaningful involvement in project organization development by community members. Again, this I think is very much going to the idea of the interest in having community solar projects that are developed because a community wants community solar in their community, rather than a developer having found space and then going to a community and sort of saying, can I build my project here? So meaningful involvement is one of those things that is, again, somewhat subjective. So we're really very much interested in adding some criteria to that. A number of these concepts are similar to some of the issues that we've looked at in Illinois Solar for All, but I think they're a bit more extensive here, and this is also an opportunity to take a fresh look at how we consider what these terms mean. Engagement in project operations and management by nonprofit organizations, public entities, or community members. So what does engagement in operations mean? That's, again, another of these concepts that we're really interested in understanding a bit better what should be a standard for engagement. And then the final item is whether or not the project has been developed in response to a site specific RFP. That one seems relatively straightforward. We did get, we have similar criteria in the initial opening block for community-driven community solar that we're looking at some of the nuances people have pointed out there as well. So I'm going to go through the next set of criteria and then sort of so we can step back. I know I'm covering a lot here, but I think it's helpful to sort of see that's sort of the primary set of criteria. Now, if we go on to the next slide, we also have these additional criteria listed here. The first one is the concept of projects that are developed in collaboration or provide complementary opportunities for a set of other programs that are enabled through the law. Increasing the diversity and location of community solar projects. This is a concept that has been around for a while that we have a proposed approach I'll get to in a moment. Located in equity investment eligible communities, there's a definition in the law of a set of communities across the state, and so consideration of those. Not being greenfield site projects, I think is something I've already mentioned. Local subscribers, we have a proposed approach to that I'll mention, and then also prioritizing smaller size projects, and then otherwise meaningfully advanced goals of more direct and tangible connections to the community. So if we can go to the next slide. So our proposal is this set of points. And again, these are all listed in the request for stakeholder feedback we released last week. So you can go through and look at these in a little bit more detail, the points we're proposing. So first, one point for projects that are developed in collaborations with those programs that were listed on the previous slide. But again, what should be a minimum requirements for collaboration is certainly a question we're interested in. We're still considering, this is an idea that's been floating around since our revised long-term plan of looking at development density of townships as a way of looking at creating increasing the diversity location of community solar projects, because again, most of them have to date been located in greenfield in more rural areas. The equity eligible investment community, we would offer a point for that, as well as for projects that don't take agricultural land out of production, although there's some subtlety of what that means that I think we're interested in feedback as there's more and more interest growing in how do you have solar potentially partner with or work in conjunction with agricultural uses. So that is certainly something that we're interested in. Our proposal, we also have a proposal that projects that commit to serving subscribers to the same county would receive 2 points, and then a recognition that there are counties in the state that have much smaller populations. So in those parts of the states, that if the county's population is below 50,000, subscribers could also come from adjacent counties. So a couple of things here would be, how long should these requirements be maintained, and how do you handle subscriber turnover? Another issue would be for very small projects, should those is a county or potentially multiple counties too large a geographic area, and should we think about smaller geographic requirements for small projects? Then finally, for projects that provide direct and tangible connections and benefits to communities, this is another of these questions where how should we evaluate that, and how long do those benefits need to last, given that these projects will be around for several decades. The equity eligible contractors will be able to develop community solar projects. So at this point in time, we're not recommending additional points for projects developed by equity eligible contractors, because they would have a separate development path as well, but we're certainly interested in feedback on that. And I actually have one more slide on this I want to go over, and then we will pause for questions and comments. So one of the issues that's come up a few times as there's been discussion about community-driven community solar is whether or not we should have a minimum score requirement. Again, this is to address the potential that if for whatever reason there is not as strong interest in this category, making sure that any project selected really do live up to the goals of having community-driven community solar. So we're proposing 6 points as a minimum score that a project would need to be considered community-driven community solar. So please take a look at the point scoring we've developed and see if that sounds like it's an adequate number of points. The other question is how to ensure, are there better ways of ensuring that there's enough community support for it? And should we consider opening things up on a first come, first served basis if, I think I may have mingled something here, hold on a moment. So yes, again, if there aren't a lot of projects, at some point, do we loosen the scoring requirements for this, or do we have some other sort of prioritization? And finally, this is a very small detail, but what should we do if, while the points system is designed to select projects, we would only use random selection if we need it for a tiebreaker. But there's also the issue of what do you do if there's a small amount of capacity left? So, for example, let's say we do a project selection process, select a number of projects, and there's 500 kilowatts of capacity left, and the next highest scored project is a 1 megawatt project. Do you let that project resize? This is what we currently do in Illinois Solar for All. Or if there's a project further down the list that is only 500 kilowatts, you skip down to the next project that would fit into the available capacity. So again, something to consider. It's on the margin, but it can be important in terms of what the final project selected in any given selection timeline. So I know I've covered a lot there, but let's pause right now and see what sort of questions and comments we have.
Thanks, Anthony. So we have two comments that are pretty related. Essentially, Jay Cordiat is pointing out that, we've dealt with a lot of these issues through the Illinois Solar for All program, and that the program administrator for that program might have worked through similar issues and might be helpful for managing these types of evaluations and prioritizations.
Sure, we certainly will tap on the expertise of our Solar for All program administrator in thinking about these issues, but there are, I think, a number of new concepts that are coming up here, and that probably go a little bit beyond some of the criteria that are within Solar for All. So, this is not simply something that we can take the Solar for All criteria and just drop it into this program, but certainly our experience, some of our thoughts on this is informed by the experience we've had in Solar for All.
We don't have any direct questions. Oh, Jay is asking if that particular manager can then be the program manager for this.
I think that's outside the scope of our conversation today.
Yeah. So no other questions directly on these topics at the moment.
Okay, great. I actually have one more slide on community-driven community solar. If you go to the next slide. So a couple other things just to think about for community-driven community solar, and this is a few places where there's a little ambiguity within the Act, is that we have some new requirements for the traditional community solar projects. The one is that they have to have at least 50% of their subscribers be small subscribers. Two is some restrictions around co-location. And three, that there's a cap on projects greater than 2 megawatts applying until after the next plan takes effect, which I think shouldn't be an issue here. But especially for the first two, we're interested in feedback on whether or not those should apply to community-driven community solar as well. It seems intuitive that they should, but it's not explicitly stated in the law. So is this something that we should consider as program requirements that would appear to be consistent with what the goals for community-driven community solar are?
All right, we still are not getting any questions or comments at this time.
Okay, great. I believe we have, so I think we're running a little ahead of schedule. We had a break scheduled now. Let's take that break and then let's take, so it's 1:44. Let me make sure I get this right because I got our timing wrong last time. Yes, we do have a break scheduled. Let's maybe reconvene at 1:50 and we will go on to discussing topics related to Illinois Solar for All. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's continue with our moving on to the Illinois Solar for All section. But before doing that, I actually want to circle back to some of the comments that Jay made in the previous section, and as I gave a little bit of thought during the break. And at one point I wanted to make related to that is the differentiation between program management and the long-term plan, which is sort of the structure for what we do. And we do have, while we have experience in the Illinois Solar for All program around some similar selection criteria, that is ultimately putting what was in our plan on Solar for All into practice. Our challenge today, or over the next coming months, is putting together a plan that lays out the principles and guidelines for how we consider community-driven community solar going forward. And so while that certainly can be informed by the experiences of Solar for All, I do want to make clear that what we need in terms of developing the plan is sort of the conceptual structure, almost sort of the policy setting around it. And that is slightly different from how things actually will be managed once we get to the point of implementing the provisions of the next long-term plan. So with that, let's turn to Illinois Solar for All. Next slide, please. One more slide from me, and then you'll get to hear a little bit from other people. The first issue I wanted to bring up related to Illinois Solar for All is thinking about a number of things connected to the interaction of Solar for All with other funding and grant opportunities. So this is one of the exciting parts of CEJA, is that there are a variety of new opportunities created by it, such as the Climate Bank or the Illinois Clean Energy Jobs and Justice Fund, or the Equity Eligible Upgrade Program. So one of the challenges that we've seen in Solar for All, in particular in the distributed generation program, which is the residential program, and the slow uptake in that program, is some of the funding challenges, either for homeowners or for smaller vendors to participate in the program, to sort of get through some of the additional costs that you might face in a housing stock that's in less good condition, or if you're a smaller business and renewable energy credit payments are not made until after a project is energized, that can cause cash flow issues. So we now have some tools that are created through CEJA that will take a while to get up and running, but that actually create some opportunities for us. But they also create some challenges. So I wanted to run through a couple of those quickly. The first one is that there's a potential that some of these entities are going to be set up in such a way that they have boards, and those boards could include solar developers who participate in Illinois Solar for All, because there's provisions about having experience working in these sectors. So what considerations and protections do we need to put into place to ensure that there are not conflicts of interest if someone is on the board of an entity that's providing funding that might help facilitate projects in Solar for All, but is also seeking to benefit from the incentive payments from Solar for All? So any thoughts on good guidelines and best practices to help avoiding those sorts of conflicts of interest is something we're interested in. Another question is, we try to set the renewable energy credit prices to be such that they allow for projects to be developed. Now there are these other, and in developing those, we've taken into account things like the federal tax credit. Now we have some other opportunities of things that could potentially infuse capital into projects. Some of that is to address maybe things like housing stock issues or cash flow issues, but these do alter the economics of projects. So one question we're interested in is, how should we factor things in so that not every project is going to make use of these other opportunities? How do we price RECs so that it works for both projects that participate in other programs and don't? I mean, an example of how we have addressed this partially to date is in the nonprofit and public facilities subprogram of Solar for All, where we have a different savings requirement for the project selection protocol, depending on whether or not the project is taking the federal investment tax credit. So we could consider options like that as well. So we're interested in people's feedback on whether or not approaches like that would make sense as a way to sort of connect the Solar for All program to these other funding opportunities. And then more generally is, while we certainly have identified the things that come out of the act, are there other funding, external funding opportunities out there that were not, maybe have not been our radar and that we've not factored into how we price renewable energy credits for the solar for all that we should think about as we update the Illinois solar for all rec prices. So I'll pause there for a moment and see if you have questions or comments on those ideas.
No comments or questions coming in yet.
Okay, great. I will next turn it over to my colleague, Jen Schmidt, for the next couple slides.
Thank you, Anthony. So first, I will be talking a little bit about the environmental justice community data. Changes made by CEJA instruct that the environmental justice communities as defined by Illinois Solar for All be used to define the location of equity investment eligible communities, which are administered by other parties, not the Illinois Power Agency. Section 8.15 of the current long-term plan details the Cal EnviroScreen indicators that were applied to determine the census tracts that we currently have for in Illinois Solar for All environmental justice communities. It uses data from the US EPA's EJ Screen tool, and that data is updated yearly. The data that we have our maps based on was published in 2019, and it is using data that was collected by the US EPA between 2014 and 2019. So our question, keeping in mind that these maps and any changes to them are going to impact more than just Illinois Solar for All, when and how frequently should the environmental justice maps be updated using the most recent EJ Screen data? Next slide. And next, for grassroots education, CEJA made some changes to the language defining grassroots education, specifying that the grassroots education funding must assist in community-driven education efforts related to the Illinois Solar for All program, including general energy education, job training program outreach efforts, and other activities deemed to be qualified by the agency, with some additional caveats that these funds go to community-based groups and other qualifying organizations, and that funding shall not be used to support the marketing by solar project development firms and organizations, unless that education provides equal opportunities for all applicable firms and organizations. So these changes are fairly reflective of our current approach to grassroots education campaigns. The current model of grassroots education that we're working with utilizes education campaigns that are conducted by grassroots nonprofits that are familiar to their communities. What types of other activities could be funded through community-based groups and other qualifying organizations that could further community-driven education efforts? And I think I've covered two kind of different topics, so I'll pause there if there are any questions or feedback at this point.
Nothing in the chat so far.
Okay, I think the next slide is bounce back to Anthony.
Great, thank you. So the next topic we're going to talk about is I'm going to talk about a little bit here, and then we're going to come back to it again a little bit more when talking about the low-income community solar subprogram of Solar for All. So one of the changes to the Illinois Solar for All program made through CEJA is the introduction of the concept of energy sovereignty. And this sort of cuts across all of the subprograms of Solar for All. And the way this basically, very similar, if not identical, language in each subprogram, that a portion of the subprogram should be reserved for projects that promote energy sovereignty. And that's sort of defined as through the ownership of projects by low-income households, nonprofit organizations providing services to low-income households, affordable housing owners, community cooperatives, or community-based limited liability companies providing services to low-income households. There's also the specification that local people have control over the project and reap the benefits of the project over and above energy bill savings. So we're interested in a number of things here, and this is probably a bit different from community solar, which is why we'll kind of re-ask this a little bit again. But first of all, one question is, what should be the general the general standard for ownership? How should that be understood to be meant? Does that mean majority ownership? Does it mean a full 100% ownership, or some other standard? We had a little bit of this issue come up previously on community solar, where we had a provision that there were some added incentives for 100% subscriber-owned community solar projects. And it turns out that was a business model that was not actually economically viable. So understanding what do we mean by ownership, because there could be certain tax and other reasons why more complicated ownership models might be required. And then also, should ownership be defined over specific periods of times? A number of developers out there do things where they hold on to the ownership of a project for a number of years so they can maximize the federal tax credits and then turn over ownership to the host of the solar project. So is a model like that something that should be considered here, or do we have to think about ownership from day one? Providing services to low-income households, again, that's something that could use more definition and clear ways to measure. We currently have the concept of critical service providers, excuse me, in a nonprofit and public facilities subprogram. We could extend that model here as a way of measuring this. Another question would be, if projects promote energy sovereignty, should the REC prices for those be different? Are there factors that cause these projects to have higher costs, and how should we recognize that? But we also want to make sure that if REC prices are higher, that the value of that flows through fully to the project ownerships, because that would seem to me to be what the goal of energy sovereignty is here. So we want to make sure that adjustments to REC prices here are actually reflected in the right policy outcomes. And finally, are there other provisions that we haven't thought about to promote energy sovereignty? Should there be some differences in what the project application requirements are? Are things like collateral requirements maybe should be thought about differently? Do projects need more time to be developed? So those are a number of questions around energy sovereignty that we're really interested in feedback on. So as we take these sort of broad and ambitious and exciting goals that are now added to Illinois Solar for All, and try to figure out through our plan how we actually will put these into practice. So we can pause there if there are any questions.
Thanks, Anthony. So we do have a question actually going back to grassroots education under Illinois Solar for All. John Delury wants to know if the grassroots education grant funding could be used to support organizations that provide technical assistance for aspiring Illinois Solar for All AVs without picking favorites, services available to all potential AVs, et cetera. And if not, do you believe that could be part of the PA's purview? That might be IPA's purview.
Or maybe program administrator.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think, Anthony, I'm not sure. This is technical assistance to aspiring Illinois Solar for All AVs is currently activities that the program administrator is currently doing as part of their approved vendor management team. Anthony, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I think some of this comes down to where the lines are drawn between education and technical assistance. And so I think that's what we would have to think about, is at what point is technical assistance not education? Also, what is the spirit of grassroots education? I mean, the word I want to make sure the word grassroots is given appropriate consideration there. That, I mean, that I view as sort of being intended to mean focused on really things that reach out to individual low-income residents and how to better educate them. And so while there certainly are pieces of the Solar for All value chain that could be maybe connected better, is grassroots education really the place where that should be supported? That would be the question I would have. But if you can paint a picture of how technical assistance would fall into those parameters, we certainly would be interested in considering that.
Okay, thanks. I don't know if that kind of closes out that question, but we do have another question on a similar topic. Theodoro Quiro asks whether, along with being paid for conducting education campaigns, can grassroots educators be paid to sign up customers? There's a lot of attrition between the number of residents that are educated versus the number that end up signing up for a subscription. If grassroots educators are allowed to sign up customers, it would assist with the large number of interested residents that fall through the cracks.
I come back to the word education, and that I think this is a disconnect. And again, the clarification, the language that was added to the law was funding shall not be used to support the marketing by solar project development firms and organizations unless such education provides equal opportunities to all applicable firms and organizations. So I would have a hard time reconciling that language with something like paying a grassroots educator on a unit basis for signing up subscribers. Now, something like an open house where providers of low-income community solar could come to, an event to have opportunity to sign up people. That's something that might be feasible as part of an education effort. But again, want to make sure that we're drawing a clear line between education and sales and marketing.
Okay, and then we have one comment on energy sovereignty, just thinking about what responsibilities an owner assumes, such as operation and maintenance, as potential evidence of energy sovereignty.
That's a really excellent point. This is something that's come up a few times on some solar for all projects in terms of how to, when they have models where the ownership changes over time, ensuring that the operations maintenance responsibilities and any commitments made by the approved vendor who initially develops the project can continue in such a way so that we don't want entities to be left with unexpected costs down the road from developing projects. So having that all clearly defined in terms of ownership and responsibility is really important. So that's a really helpful comment.
Okay, that's it for now on this topic.
I believe I have the next slide. Okay. New language in the IPA Act created by CEJA instructs the agency to make every effort to enable solar providers already participating in the adjustable block program in the small DG block to easily participate in the 1 to 4 unit distributed generation program in Illinois Solar for All and vice versa. So the question that we are wanting feedback on is, what barriers do developers of small DG projects face in Illinois Solar for All that can be reduced to promote new approved vendor participation in Illinois Solar for All? Particularly, we're interested in hearing about barriers that are faced by vendors that are currently only operating an AVP and aren't able to make that switch to also develop under Solar for All. Next, the Illinois Solar for All program administrator has taken a number of steps to assist participant access to Illinois Solar for All in the past year, including an offer sheet that lists standard offers available from Illinois Solar for All approved vendors, a referral process that connects interested potential participants with approved vendors, and the option for potential participants to complete the income verification process with the program administrator directly. And although activity in this subprogram has grown slightly in the last year, this program still needs substantial growth. So on this topic, the questions that we're hoping stakeholders can provide feedback on include what are other ways that Illinois Solar for All approved vendors can be supported to increase interest in developing Solar for All residential solar projects? How can approved vendors be supported to encourage project development in areas that are currently underserved by Illinois Solar for All approved vendors. Particularly, we don't have a whole lot of approved vendor coverage in Southern Illinois, and we're looking to increase interest and development there. If you are recommending changes to the Illinois Solar for All REC prices, what specific cost components would need adjustment? And this goes back to our conversation earlier this morning with NREL's, the link that Ben Paulos provided with NREL's cost components. And then finally, as we look at the expanded development of the low-income distributed generation sub-program, what should ongoing stakeholder engagement or stakeholder feedback processes look like to inform these ongoing activities and expanding growth in this sub-program? And then finally, Illinois Solar for All has a requirement that incentives deliver tangible economic benefits to the eligible low-income participants. In master metered buildings where the units are not individually metered, but the whole building has a single meter that covers all of the residences, program eligibility currently requires the owner to commit to passing along at least 50% of the energy savings to all of the tenants, regardless of income levels. And the owner has to communicate that these benefits are a result from the installation of solar. So how can we better define tangible economic benefits? What does that look like? Are there specific guidelines to the types of benefits that should be considered? Are there types that should not be considered as being in the spirit of Illinois Solar for All? And then what does energy sovereignty look like for multifamily projects? We go back to what Anthony was talking about a few minutes ago. And I'll stop there and open it up for questions since we hit on a few topics underneath the DG sub-program.
Nothing at the moment.
All right.
In the chat.
Okay, then we'll go on to the next slide. For the nonprofit and public facilities sub-program, the ABP.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jen. I missed one.
Mm-hmm.
We do have a question. So Jay Courgette is asking for feedback on disposition of the funds. So lots of money is sitting in the low income distributed generation program. Is it feasible for the program to grow and utilize existing funds in a timely fashion, or would it be better to redistribute that money to other sub-programs?
So I think there's a few layers of issues here. The first is that until a new plan is approved, this is where we're governed by some of the provisions of the existing plan, where when the commission approved our last plan, one of the things that they explicitly included in that approval was that the fund to the distributed generation sub-program would not be reallocated to other sub-programs. So that's a short-term answer. Now, looking forward, we can propose new approaches on new plans, and maybe we'll adopt, have different approaches adopted. That being said, there is a change in the allocation of funding between the various sub-programs that CEJA has. So we will have a different set of allocations there as well. But ultimately, our goal is that low-income distributed generation is an important way of bringing the benefits of the solar economy to low-income households. And so my hope is that we ultimately find a way to make that program more successful with higher participation so that the funding that's there will ultimately be used for that sub-program. But certainly thinking about some flexibility going forward is something that we will need to consider. And this was a contested issue in our last plan. I would imagine would continue to be so going forward.
Thanks. There aren't any more questions. We can go back to this nonprofit public facilities. So CEJA expands the adjustable block program to create a block dedicated for solar projects installed at public schools with priorities for projects located within EJ communities. Since the adjustable block program will now include a category specifically for public schools, should public schools no longer be eligible to participate in the Illinois Solar for All? Currently, public schools are considered a critical service provider, and as long as they meet the qualifications of being located in either an EJ or low-income community, public schools have been part of the nonprofit public facilities program. So is that something that still should be considered if there is another program block from the ABP that can serve them? And second, are there types of schools that wouldn't qualify for this new block under the ABP that should still be considered eligible for Illinois Solar for All in the nonprofit public facilities subprogram? Next, CEJA also created a new Illinois Solar for All subprogram for low-income large multifamily solar projects with incentives targeting residential buildings with 5 or more units. Currently, multifamily residences have also been able to qualify under the nonprofit public facilities subprogram or the low-income distributed generation program. But with the creation of a large multifamily subprogram specifically, should multifamily residential housing no longer be eligible for the nonprofit and public facilities subprogram and only eligible for the new low-income large multifamily solar subprogram? Okay. And then next, Section 8.6.3 of the current plan requires the organizations that host nonprofit public facilities to be a critical service provider for the community. And in the plan, there are examples of youth centers, hospitals, schools, homeless shelters, senior centers, community centers, places of worship, affordable housing providers, including public housing sites. In our approved vendor manual, section 4.2, we expand on this even further, giving a list of over 25 other qualifying nonprofit entities. And approved vendors have requested the program administrator to consider other service providers as entities that are to be judged as a critical service provider. And some of those requests have been approved and some have not been. Should the criteria for critical service providers be refined to include a requirement that the facility demonstrate that it provides a majority of its efforts and activities to low-income participants? Currently, it's only required to be located in the low-income or EJ community. It doesn't technically state that a majority of its efforts must be directed to low-income participants. But given the high interest in this subprogram, is this something that we should be tightening up? And flowing into that next question, are there changes to the list of the critical service providers that should be considered? Again, you know, with the high interest in this subprogram, and we have not had to roll over funds between program years. Is the list of critical service providers that we consider overly expansive? Should we trim it back, or are there other entities that we should consider to add to the critical service provider list? And I'll stop there for questions.
No questions or comments on this slide.
Okay, I think I am turning it over to Sharon and Anthony then.
Great, thank you, Jen. I'll take the next slide. This circles back to something that I already brought up, but I wanted to focus it in a little bit on low-income community solar and the concept of energy sovereignty, because I think there's different set of issues here for what does community ownership of a community solar project look like, given that the project is going to have a host it's going to have subscribers, and those may or may not be the same. Subscribers, there'll be a certain turnover there. So what we're interested in, what does community ownership of a community solar project looks like? Again, the 100% community ownership model we saw, seen and understand is not viable, but what would be some sort of model in between? What level of ownership is appropriate? How does that work in terms of, are we talking about subscribers owning it, or is this ownership of a project that, by a nonprofit, for example, that serves a community? There also then are financial risks to community that might come from long-term ownership. I think this is a little bit of a variation of the question Jay asked about ongoing operations and maintenance issues. How do we make sure that with ownership also comes protection from future costs that may come, and and who is best suited to handle ongoing operations and maintenance costs. Similarly, there's costs with subscriber acquisition and turnover, bill management, and the like, and how do we make sure that those are properly accounted for? And then, we previously had proposed, I believe it was a $5 rec adder for projects that were 100% subscriber owned. No project ever sought to make use of that provision. But again, are there some factors that we should consider in terms of thinking about appropriate incentives for community solar projects that have energy, that feature ownerships? And then, what does ownership by a low income household look like? Is this, how would you become an owner of a community solar project? I know there's some models around the country on this, some sort of co-op type of models, et cetera. But we don't have great visibility into what have been the most effective models, especially given our restructured energy market. What will work here in terms of bringing in the idea of individual ownership to community solar and for low-income community solar projects. And finally, since there's some provisions around an energy sovereignty about benefits that are over and above bill savings, since your participation in a community solar project is manifested itself purely in net metering credits on your bill, that's different than if you're actually hosting the solar project on your facility. How should we think about what are potential benefits that are over and above bill savings for low-income community solar projects? So if there's any questions or feedback on those topics, we'd be interested in hearing it.
No comments or questions in the chat
Okay,
right
great.
now.
I believe Sharon will be taking the next slide.
Thank you, Anthony. When we solicit feedback on the Solar for All workforce development, low-income participation regarding equity, we'd like to consider two main topics as we think about connecting graduates in this first section here of the job training program with vendors. What else can be done to enhance the facilitation of this activity when we consider increase of intake of trainees by the participating firms and their administrators? Also, we'd like to take into consideration for the second half of lastly, think about some of the clarity of what some of the characteristics when we're thinking about small and emerging businesses. What will be some of the identifying traits related to these businesses to define them as small and or emerging businesses? Do we look at characteristics as revenue or people employed? So we'd like some feedback on that as well. Next slide. I think, I'll pause for a question because I think Anthony's going to take the next slide.
So we do have one comment, but I believe it actually relates back to the Solar for All slides with regard to how to provide tangible benefits beyond just the savings on your electricity bill. Kim Knowles suggests that a cooperative model with the ability to purchase shares of I assume she's referring to purchase shares in ownership of the facility could provide benefits beyond just the energy savings.
Thank you. That's helpful feedback. I think one thing we would need to think about in that model is that currently one of our provisions in Solar for All that was focused mostly on distributed generation, but also applies in community solar, is the concept of that there's no upfront cost to the participant. So if we move to a model where ownership features the purchase of shares, we would also have to rethink the tangible benefits aspects of Solar for All and how that would work. And again, maybe in order to make this work, if a cooperative model is what's needed, that would be an appropriate reconsideration there. So that would be something that someone could, if anyone has opportunity to flesh out ideas around what a cooperative model with shares would look like, that would be really helpful. Obviously, there's a long tradition of this in things like food co-ops that we could turn to look at for possible models.
Thanks, Anthony. We have another question. John Delury wants to know if there have been any initial thoughts about the interaction between the new Illinois Solar for All administrators' employee-employer matchmaking roles and the new responsibilities in the Clean Workforce Equity Database provisions.
Why don't we actually go to the next slide, because it touches on aspects of that. So one of the new provisions in the Act is that, excuse me, there's two that we want to look at. I'm sorry, I think I'm on the wrong slide. Can you go back a slide? Okay, yeah, so this I got my slides confused, my apologies. I don't think we have detailed thoughts on this yet, but I mean, we're interested in stakeholder feedback on this because there are a number of different provisions that are being created, different databases being created. There's obviously some changes taking place in the job training programs, and we are really looking at how all those pieces fit together.
Okay, there aren't any other questions in the chat.
Okay, now let's move on to the next slide. My apologies. Okay, so the final piece on Solar for All that we're interested excuse me, in feedback on is that there is a new provision that the renewable energy credits procured through the program come from across a breadth of low-income and environmental justice communities, including both urban and rural, and not just concentrated in a few communities. So one of the challenges we had in thinking about this was that for communities, low-income community solar and the nonprofit and public facilities sub-programs in years past, we've had a project selection protocol. And that includes in it, for example, a regional environmental justice score that we use in low-income community solar to help prioritize the selection of community solar projects in places where selected projects are disproportional to the distribution of environmental justice communities. So one of the things we heard very loud and clear from approved vendors is that if we're going to have a project selection process that ultimately selects projects, the more lead time, the way that criteria is defined, the better, because projects have a certain development timeline, and someone doesn't want to start developing a project and then see the project selection protocol and discover that their project is just not going to score well on it. So one of the things we had proposed was really not really trying to minimize changes year to year in the project selection protocol and holding it firm for a while. So on the other hand, we have this provision that makes us look a little bit differently at how to prioritize things around the state, the selection of projects around the state. So what we're curious about what we should do and how quickly should we implement changes to project selection protocols so that there is visibility by approved vendors into what that looks like. Another aspect of this is project selection only works, obviously, if, so let me rephrase that. Using project selection protocol as a way to make sure projects are distributed across the geographic area only works if you're in fact having project selection. If a program is not oversubscribed, you don't have, that's not available as a tool for ensuring this. So we're also interested in feedback on what sort of approaches could we consider for sub-programs where we're not doing project selection, but we're really accepting projects as they come in. What can be done there to help ensure projects are spread out across the state?
No questions on this coming in.
Okay, great. Thank you. We're now going to shift topics and discuss consumer protections. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kelly Turner.
Thanks, Anthony. Good afternoon, everyone. As Anthony mentioned, I'm Kelly Turner. I'm the Deputy Legal Counsel for the Illinois Power Agency. Megan, could you actually advance the slide one more? I apologize, everyone. My slides got out of order on these first two. As Anthony mentioned, we're going to move into the topic of consumer protections. We're going to be discussing those under both the Adjustable Block Program and the Illinois Solar for All program. This first slide here is just a little bit on background. The agency's initial long-term plan that was approved by the Illinois Commerce Commission in docket 170838 included provisions for the development of consumer protection guidelines with stakeholder input following the commission's approval of the plan. The agency and the program administrators for the Adjustable Block Program and Illinois Solar for All developed marketing guidelines, program brochures, and standardized disclosure forms through a stakeholder process that followed the finalization of the initial plan. And the marketing guidelines and those other materials that I mentioned have been updated through additional stakeholder processes, including specific revisions that came out of the approval of the agency's revised long-term plan in ICC docket number 190995. What we're going to be discussing today, though, are actually questions that are arising from the changes to Public Act under Public Act 1020662, which specify the agency's responsibilities related to consumer protection on a going forward basis. Mega, if you could go back one slide, please. So turning now to questions that arise from changes to Section 175C1M of the IPA Act. The agency is directed to establish a registration process for entities that seek to qualify for program administered incentive funding. So that is incentives under the Adjustable Block Program or under Illinois Solar for All. We are to maintain a list of approved entities on each program website, and we are authorized to revoke and approve vendors' ability to receive incentive funding status upon a determination that the vendor has failed to comply with contract terms, the law, or other program requirements. So some of the questions that we have arising out of this change in law is whether the current disciplinary processes that we have in place under the Adjustable Block and Illinois Solar for All programs establish a sufficient process for revocation of the ability to receive state-administered incentive funding. We're seeking feedback on what type of improvements might be necessary or changes are needed to those processes in order for them to be effective and provide effective consumer protections. Currently, entities that are suspended are listed in the disciplinary action report. If any entity had their participation status revoked, they would also be listed there. We're seeking feedback on whether the identity of entities whose approved vendor applications are denied and are therefore ineligible for participation in the program should also be included in this report, or should those application denials otherwise be published. On the topic of designees, which are defined in the programs as subcontractors that have direct interactions with customers, They are currently subject to the same disciplinary processes as approved vendors, but they do not have the same registration process under the Adjustable Block Program. If the agency determines that designees should also apply for the ability to participate in the program, which items of the approved vendor application should be inapplicable to the designee registration process, or what other additional items should we include in a designee registration process beyond what is currently required? Currently, the registration is a really simple process, and there is no real application or questions there. Mega, you can go ahead and go on to the next slide. Yep, thank you. Changes under section 175C1M2 require the IPA to establish minimum contract terms and conditions to ensure that projects are properly installed and produce their expected amounts of energy. In the Adjustable Block Program, there are currently no minimum contract terms for community solar contracts. So the agency will be developing those, and we're interested in stakeholder feedback as to whether we should consider differences between traditional and community-driven community solar projects in the development of those terms and conditions. Should they be the same? What considerations should be made for the different types of projects that may warrant different minimum contract terms? Another item that came up, I think, in previous stakeholder feedback requests that the agency released in 2020 is that we are considering including minimum system design criteria on customer disclosure forms for distributed generation projects. And we are seeking feedback as to whether certain system efficiencies should also be included in the minimum contract terms and conditions for distributed generation projects as well. So if participants have any information or feedback that they'd like to provide as to not only whether or not these should be included, but if they should be included in the minimum contract terms and conditions for DG projects, what an appropriate level or what system efficiency should be included. Okay, Mega, you can go on to the next slide. Also under that same section of the Act, vendors who have a disproportionately high number of deficient systems may lose their eligibility to continue to receive state-administered incentive funding through agency programs and procurements. We have some questions about this language, specifically what would warrant consideration as a disproportionately high number of deficient systems. Is there a certain percentage of projects associated with a particular vendor or designee that should be a threshold for suspension or loss of eligibility to continue in the program? And or over what time period should we be looking at the deficiencies? Is there some other measure by which we would determine what a disproportionately high number of deficient systems is? Taking a slight step back, the agency is going to require that repairs, alterations, and additions to remedy deficient systems be brought to our attention either through customer, oh, I'm sorry, this is misworded, but there will be either customer complaints or on-site inspections that bring deficiencies to the program administrator and or the agency's attention. The plan proposal would be that systems which are not meeting their expected output or cause damage to customers' property and or are materially non-conforming with the REC contract may be considered as deficient systems. We're seeking feedback as to whether or not additional categories of deficient systems should be considered. If so, what would those considerations be? And should the agency consider valid complaints from a customer about a transaction, such as payment delays, application delays, lack of communications, charges and fees that are not disclosed? Would items of that nature constitute a deficient system? And finally, should systems which fail to meet a baseline energy production level, such as shaded systems or north-facing systems, which meet expected output but have unusually low expected output, be considered as deficient systems? I've covered a lot of information on the last two slides, so I just want to pause for a moment and see if anyone has any questions before we get into the next couple questions.
I'm not seeing any questions or comments in the chat right now.
Okay, thanks. We can go ahead and go on to the next item. Thank you. Section 175C1M3 authorizes the agency to require standardized disclosure forms for customers. This is already a requirement for systems to participate in the Adjustable Block Program and under Illinois Solar for All. We are interested in feedback on the format and the scope of the disclosure forms going forward in the program, looking at whether or not any of these items can be refined or improved. So to that end, we have a few questions here about the disclosure forms themselves. Should the standardized disclosure form take the format of a more limited document than what is already provided to customers? It would contain necessary information specific only to the customer's system or subscription and the associated financial obligations. Under this scenario, we contemplate that there would be an accompanying document which explains the disclosure form and its contents to customers, along with the standard disclosure form, but that the form itself would be more circumscribed than it is now. Next is the current format of the distributed generation disclosure form, which varies by financing type, sufficient for customer education. Is further differentiation between the financing structures necessary for customers to understand the transaction that they are involved in, or is differentiation between project categories, thinking towards the new categories that are being developed under the Adjustable Block Program, is that appropriate or necessary for disclosures for those customers? Finally, the agency currently requires that the Illinois Solar for All disclosure forms include information on net metering rates, which are necessary for determining the minimum savings requirements under Illinois Solar for All, while the Adjustable Block Program disclosure forms do not include those rates, the specific rates that are available. Should the net metering rates be provided to approved vendors and designees by the program administrators for all disclosure forms across both ABP and Illinois Solar for All, or should those rates be posted to the program websites for customer reference, or is there another kind of avenue towards customer education about net metering that perhaps we haven't considered for the disclosure forms that should be incorporated? Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat. We can go ahead and go on to the next slide, which is the last slide that we have on consumer protection issues. So if anyone has any questions about anything that I have addressed already, please make sure to put those in the chat because I believe that this is the last section and we'll be wrapping up after this. Finally, on consumer complaint centers, we are required to establish one or more consumer complaint centers to accept complaints regarding businesses that participate in or otherwise benefit from state administered incentive funding through the agency's programs. And we are required to maintain a public database of complaints. We currently have a public database of complaints that is on the Illinois Shines and the Adjustable Block Program website. The current disciplinary process that we have in place includes the provision of warning letters to entities that have violated program requirements, but perhaps those violations do not warrant a suspension. So the agency is seeking feedback on whether or not the database should be expanded to include identification of entities, not only those which have received a suspension, but also those that are warned for violations of program requirements. The thought is that this would also include a description of the type of violations or the number of warnings that entity has received. We're, in addition to soliciting feedback on the inclusion of warnings in the complaint database, we're seeking feedback on additional information that perhaps is not currently included in the complaint database that should be added. Finally, this doesn't quite get to consumer complaint centers, but is somewhat on the topic in that it would be something that a consumer center could provide to customers. We're seeking feedback as to whether the Adjustable Block Program administrator should develop a page on the Illinois Shine website to which approved vendors or designees may post standardized offers for DG projects and community solar subscriptions. We envision that this would be similar to the standardized offers that are posted under the Illinois Solar for All program. Our thought is that this type of a solar marketplace could allow customers to compare offers as well as receive information and education on solar development. So we're seeking feedback on whether this approach would be valuable to approved vendors and designees who are participating in the program, and whether or not it would be valuable to customers. Are there examples from other states that we could look to of these types of marketplaces or programs that may provide value to participants in the Adjustable Block Program? That wraps up the items that we're seeking feedback on for consumer protection, but I thought I'd just double check to see if there's any questions that may have come in.
I don't see any in the chat, and I don't think anyone's hands is raised or anything like that, so I think we're good.
Thanks, Sarah. In that case, then I'll turn it back over to Anthony to wrap things up.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for participating today. I know we've covered a lot of topics, a lot of ground, and it's a lot of information to process and think about. And I want to pause for a moment here. If there are anything that we've gone over today that people want to circle back to, since we're well ahead of where we plan to be on this, that this is an opportunity for any final questions or comments or clarifications of things that have come up, we'd be happy to take a few minutes right now. Otherwise, if we don't get anything after a couple of minutes, we will wrap up the workshop early, and we really look forward to everyone's written comments that will be due on December 3rd. So let's just give it a minute or two to see if there's any final questions or comments. Okay, I don't see anything coming in, or I don't believe anyone has raised their hand. So maybe this is, If there are no final questions or comments, I'd like to thank everybody for participating today, and we'll give you back an extra hour of your afternoon. So thank you and have a great day. Take care.